So let me welcome you all to the Fermanian Conference Room on campus at Point Loma Nazarene University for tonight's City Club event. All of our events are made available on YouTube, as this will be. And this is special for me because I've known this gentleman for a while. And when he was elevated to the position of the editor of the editorial page, I thought, along with a whole lot of other people, that was a very great thing. And if you read the Union-Tribune day by day, and you should, and if you don't actually have the paper in hand, you should be reading it digitally, you will see that he's had a major effect. He's going to talk to us about fake news, real problems, a crash course in citizen journalism. Welcome, please, Matthew Hall.
Thank you, George. Thank you all for being here. I know that you had to give up your viewing of the NFL draft. Oh wait, this is San Diego. We don't have a football team anymore. Thank you for spending some time here tonight. This is an important talk just to kind of ground you all in what this talk is. I and other journalists at the Union-Tribune and from around San Diego have been giving this in schools, both high schools and colleges, and in libraries the last few months. The term fake news, as you'll see, a lot of people assume that that is a modern invention, that has only been around since the last presidential campaign. That is fake news. The term has been around for a long time, as you'll see. I think the takeaways from this towards the end of the presentation are super important. I think there's 11 tips we have for how you all can differentiate real news from fake news. And so there's some kind of hands-on stuff that you all can learn. As George pointed out, I've been in this position for a couple years now, but I've been with the Union-Tribune since 2001. Being first as a reporter, then as an editor, then as a columnist, social media manager, and during the last presidential election, got to write a lot about that from the opinion pages, which was an interesting time, obviously. The longtime readers of the Union-Tribune will know that that was the first time, the 2016 election, the newspaper's editorial board had ever endorsed a Democrat for president in the 148-year history of the newspaper dating back to 1868. That was kind of a big deal. It was an international story. I was interviewed twice by BBC Scotland. So the Union-Tribune is big in Scotland, which was kind of cool. But let's talk a little bit about fake news. And this is interactive. If you guys have questions, raise a hand, shout it out. This project, this is designed to be interactive. Starting here. Who knows what this is? A prize to whoever shouts it out first. This is an easy one. The questions get harder, believe me. Thank you. First Amendment. Yeah. The very first amendment, right? This was written, as you can see, in 1791. A long time ago. It's one of the reasons why journalism has persevered in this country, despite some slings and arrows. I like to say that there are two industries protected in the Bill of Rights, which is obviously the first 10 amendments this country has. Who knows what the second industry is? Religion. No? Religion isn't an industry. Guns. The second, see, I kind of gave you a hint there for those who caught it. The second industry, obviously, is the gun industry. A lot of journalists will say, well, we're the only industry protected, and that's not quite the case. But those protections are very valuable and something that we take very seriously. Right, so I like to frame the conversation this way when I'm talking about fake news. Let's talk about real news, right? If we can all agree on what real news is, fake news becomes far less important. Real news is this. If you look at the adjectives in this first sentence, you're going to see words like real, honest, actual, true, right? Those are pretty key adjectives that kind of sum up what we do on a daily basis. They are all the opposite of fake. So real news includes the perspectives from a diverse group of people. And this is true whether you're writing for the unbiased news side of an outlet or, from my perspective, on the opinion side, right? Real news is factually accurate. This is a key point that often gets lost. It acknowledges that people can see and perceive and interpret the same facts differently. Importantly, not that the facts are different, but that people's perceptions of them can be different. And real news has no agenda other than a search for the truth. You're going to see a lot of politicians use fake news for convenience. When a story says something that they don't want you to believe, they're going to call it fake news because they think that it minimizes the story. Real journalists are just looking for the story and just trying to search for that truth.
Say that.
Yeah,
You said we could comment.
please do.
Can you go back? I think at the very end it says truth, maybe the phrase ever elusive truth. Because truth means different things to very many people.
Yeah, well, that's what we got at with the bullet point ahead of it. But how do you mean? How do you think truth means different things to different people?
Because it's elusive, it's like water in your hands. There are truths and there are perceived truths. It's a whole long discussion.
Well, I see what you mean, but if you have water in your hand, do you have a solid in your hand? No, you have a liquid in your hand. It's a fact, it's truth that that is a liquid, not a solid. And so I think the trick for journalism is we need to acknowledge that people perceive facts differently, but that the facts themselves underlying those assumptions and perceptions don't change, right? And this actually is probably a good time to get into false equivalencies. When we're journalists, like let's use climate change, for example. That's the one that springs to mind. Now, a journalist, like when I was covering City Hall, super controversial time, very combative time, I would count up the number of lines in each of my stories from one side and the other. And the quotes would be the same, you know what I mean? I would go to great lengths to make sure that if someone criticized me, I could say, no, I took that seriously, and I went to count that level of detail. Climate change, you don't need one scientist and one climate skeptic. That's a false equivalence, right? If everyone agrees that there are 99 scientists in a room and 100 scientists in a room, 99 of them say climate change is happening and it's caused by humans, that is a fact. So part of journalism is putting stuff in context, right? But to your point, yeah, people see facts differently, so that's where journalism gets tricky. And I think that's where the opening for fake news accusations comes in. So thank you for bringing that up. So what does that mean? What do journalists have to do, right? On a daily basis, this kind of is what we do. We need to be mindful of our own biases and our own blind spots, right? I like to tell a story of back in the day at the Union-Tribune, a bunch of white men, one Latina sitting around in a room trying to talk about the day's stories, the big day stories, and this was the day that Selena died. Now, we all know now that Selena is a major news story, a major artist, major creative force, and their death was a huge deal, especially in a border town. And they weren't, the white guys in the room weren't going to put that on the story until the Latina spoke up and said, no, this is really a big story. So we need to put this on the front page. Cultural biases, blind spots, super important. This is why you see a lot of pushes in newsrooms now talking about diversity and the fact that we need diversity not only in our stories, but in our actual newsrooms so we don't miss important discussions. I talked about ensuring that word choices are appropriate. The overall tone of a story is super important. And you see this a lot in stories like abortion stories that are very kind of complex and emotional. From the get-go, those are stories that are trying to be, arguments that are trying to be won in their characterizations, pro-life, pro-choice. So we need to be mindful of labels in our journalism. And this is all what real journalists do. Present a diversity of views in their fairest light. The fairest light is important. If you are a reporter with liberal leanings or conservative leanings, and you are a real journalist, you need to set those leanings aside and make sure that your coverage is as fair as it can be to people who may see the world in a different way than you do. And this is maybe the most important point. Real journalists let readers draw their own conclusions, right? not opinion. On the opinion side, we're going to try to argue our way, but also be responsive and receptive to other points of view. Real journalists on the news side, no matter the medium, are going to let readers draw their own conclusions. And then this last point has shifted and become increasingly important. Be transparent in the reporting process. There should be no surprises in the story for our subjects. Our watchdog team has a policy where if we're going to say something about you, report on an allegation or an accusation or some sort of wrongdoing, you're going to have 24-hour notice. And then if you don't respond in 24 hours, then we'll run our story. But we're not going to sandbag or ambush you in the course of our reporting. And the transparency extends beyond the reporting process. Social media allows critics to attack us at any hour of the day. And believe me, it is any hour of the day. I'm on Twitter from like 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. and people can reach me and have to compliment me and to criticize me at basically any hour of the day. And so it extends beyond the reporting process. Journalists need to share their stories because they need people to see them and read them and listen to them. But they also need to be available for criticism, right? Just the other day, another reporter in town criticized the entire editorial section on my watch. And so I, on Twitter, kind of line by line, rebutted some of the points in her essay.
But who was this?
That was Sarah Libby at the Voice of San Diego.
I read it.
What'd you think of it?
I thought she was incorrect. And I appreciate, because I read the editorial page of the Union-Tribune, I appreciate how you lay things out. And I thought she was looking for a fight for no reason. I don't know why she did that. I usually like what she has to say. It's one of the few stories she wrote that I thought was a little crazy. I don't know. I don't know what was going on. She's got a big thing about transparency, so I don't know if she thought you were hiding something, hiding your opinion. I don't know what she was after.
Yeah, I mean, for those who didn't see the story, she criticized us for about 5 situations where she said we didn't have an opinion, where we didn't take a stand. 3 of those were in elections where we definitely did take a stand at a later date.
Well, she did put that in at the end.
Well, she corrected it, right, after I complained.
On another
That, to her credit, she listened. She's doing what I talked about, listening to critics, considering the criticism, and updating stories and being transparent. So to her credit, she did that. And as other people said on Twitter, that was a good conversation to have. 2 journalists at 2 influential outlets should be having those conversations. So I appreciate your feedback, though. So fairness in journalism, right? Yeah.
There must be a big difference between what you're talking about an investigative reporting, like a big long story, where at the end they say, well, he really did it. I mean, it seems like if they go through all of the facts, they usually say, what their conclusion is, right? Don't they?
Well, on the opinion page, yes. On the news side, an investigation, the job is to let the readers draw their own conclusions. So we've done a lot of reporting on Duncan Hunter, for example. What you think of Duncan Hunter is up to you. We can tell you, here's the paper trail, here's the financial trail, here's where he spent this money, et cetera, et cetera. Is that coming down with an opinion or a point of view on that? No, it's kind of laying out the facts for you to judge.
You know how the New Yorker does these long stories, and they certainly have done a whole lot on people that are related to Trump and about the dossier, for example. It seems like they leave you without sort of doubt at the end what exactly took place here.
Yeah, and we can talk about news outlets and how they cover certain things. On the dossier, the day that story broke, the Union-Tribune didn't report it.
Right.
Because we couldn't verify its substance. We weren't going to rely on, this is like the old school of journalism. National Enquirer reports it. Do we report it? Well, that's a National Enquirer, so no. I'm not comparing the New Yorker to the National Enquirer by any
It does
means.
seem like there's a difference between certain New York Times does very long articles on a certain issue.
Yeah, and towards the end of this, I have a great slide that kind of gets at some of those points. So if you want to kind of sit on that thought, we'll definitely come back to it. It's a very important element of journalism. So we talk about some of these: inclusion, fairness, and accuracy kind of ground everything we do. They're critical to ensuring our credibility. This is a word you're going to hear a lot, I think, in modern journalism. With transparency comes credibility. You need to be credibility. You can spend years and years and years building that credibility. It can be gone in a day. One bad tweet or one bad story, and people can criticize you and hold that against you.
An example that comes to mind is at the New York Times, since we're talking about it, and Judith Miller.
Sure.
The Times was a paper of record for the United States. And I actually took personal offense at it because I trusted what was being reported, even though my intuition could have been. I was very reserved on certain things. And when it came to light that was just a echo chamber or a mouthpiece for the administration at the time, and the effect of that, and how powerful or compelling they were in the whole argument or debate that really didn't take place, but in taking us to war, I found that very disturbing. And I've had the opportunity to ask journalists along the way, how do we respond to that? And it seems to me that, I don't know if within the profession they've taken deep stock of that, but it doesn't seem I've ever gotten satisfactory, feeling about that, hey, this was a serious breach, we did some damage, and I wonder if those were some of the predicates for where we are today.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, that story was horrible. You know what I
It
mean?
was a series over years.
Yeah. No, and the fact that it was a high-profile reporter at a high-profile outlet on the most high-profile story of that time, arguably.
Talking about the Iraq War and that woman.
Correct. Judith Miller. Correct. And this is what I talk about with credibility. Every day, journalists have to fight for their own credibility, the credibility of their outlet, and the credibility of the profession, right? So I'm on the local and the national board of the Society of Professional Journalists. Our ethics code is the most popular element of anything we do.
It's the most precious asset.
That's well said, yeah. I agree with that. It's known internationally. I get the analytics for our website, views every month. It's by far, by a factor of double digits, the most popular post on our site. And that's because what that does is it's not like, we're not going to kick you out of the club if you don't follow it. It's not like that. But it really is the most important thing that journalists can, young journalists, old journalists alike, can consider when they're doing their job. The two biggest tenets of our ethics code are seek the truth and report it, right? So that's one tenet, but kind of two different things. You have to look for the truth and then figure out a way to get that in the paper. The second tenet is to minimize harm. And that means minimize harm for the sources, for the subjects of your stories. So you need to make sure that they know what you're doing and that you're treating them fairly. It means minimize harm for the outlet, your outlet. Don't get it wrong. A lot of times when I give this talk, I have this libel suit. It's like a red glaring jacket. You guys might have seen it on Twitter with the word libel written probably 50 times around it. And I like to say that's the only libel suit I hope I ever get. Right? Credibility, one libel suit, one problem like that can really kind of wreck not only the journalist career, but like you said, there have been other journalists at the New York Times that have had problems. There have been other journalists in the industry that made stuff up out of whole cloth. I think we need to kind of police each other, but we need to stand up for what's right as well as to kind of decry what's wrong. So I talk about choosing words with care, give sources up. I mean, all this kind of falls into what we were just talking about, right? About Judith Miller and the Times. Fairly represent people, choose words and thoughts with care, give sources adequate opportunity to respond. And again, diversity and sourcing, super important, right? All types of diversity. And this needs to be reflected in your news coverage. I like to say, that the strongest editorials not only make the strongest arguments for a thing, but also counter the other side's strongest arguments, right? And so we're not shutting off lines of thought and lines of thinking. And to your point about the Union-Tribune editorial page kind of reflecting all views, I pride myself on that, so I hope people hold me to account when we don't do that. But I think one of the reasons we do that is because in an opinion post, we can say this is where we think the one outcome should be, and then address the other outcomes too. right? So here's it goes, fake news. This is one of my favorite pictures on the internet. As you can see, it's from 1894. And we have four gents in bowler hats running around with their newspapers. Cheap sensation, fake news, and humbug news. I like to say that hashtag humbug news would be funnier and better than fake news, but fake news is the one that took off. But this is from 1894. So anyone who thinks that the President of the United States invented the term and popularized it, not so much. This dates back to the 1800s. What has changed is that fake news is a spectrum, right? It's misinformation and disinformation. Back in the day, it used to be misinformation. So it was reporting without context or poor reporting. And now it's literally weaponized. The term has been weaponized. Fake news stories, the interesting thing, a lot of people say, oh, well, it was political what happened in the last election. And all these fake news stories were done by the people who wanted the other team to win. A lot of those fake news sites were created bashing one side or the other, and they were done by like Clinton supporters bashing Clinton or Trump supporters bashing Trump because it was money. As you see a term here, propaganda. How many of you guys have heard that term before? I'd never heard about it till this election. It's literally propaganda done for money, right? So on the spectrum of fake news, you have bad journalism, context-less journalism, and then it moves to conspiracy theories, clickbait. You guys know that term. It just basically means you have a sensational headline that you want people to click through. Hoaxes, and then, of course, humbug news, right? And sometimes people ask me, well, what is humbug news? And I don't necessarily know. I wasn't around in 1894 when this magazine was printed. But my take on humbug news is what we talked about before. It's when a politician wants to kind of get ahead of the story or change the story or rebut the story, but can't because it's locked down, airtight, and the facts are the facts. But they will say, no, that's humbug news, that's fake news, because they think they can, pull the wool over the public's eyes. And increasingly, as you'll see here, that wool is being pulled over our eyes.
Excuse me, sir?
Yeah.
What is distinctive about hoaxes? I think I understand the term, but in your continuum,
Yeah.
we don't use that term very much anymore. It seems like maybe some of the others have displaced it. So-
Well, no, a hoax. It's like Pizzagate. Do you guys know this story? Where, if you Google that, you'll know. They created this whole fake thing about we'll Google it.
But does intent weigh in on the hoax?
Oh yeah, I think a hoax is an intent, right? Hoax isn't a mistake or an accidental story. Hoax is you are literally trying to fool someone.
For the purpose of fooling. Right?
Correct. Yeah. And so this is why people think that fake news is a relatively new term. This chart is pretty amazing. It's from BuzzFeed, and it shows you the top 20 examples of like mainstream news stories. I'm not really sure the outlets, but an example would be like the Washington Post or the New York Times. And then top 20 examples of fake news, of just literally made up stories. And you can see this is from 2016, early parts of the year to middle parts of the year. Fake news is kind of hanging out where it deserves to be, in the gutter. But mainstream news, and this is a trend that cuts across every statistic in journalism these days, it's going in the wrong direction, going down. Fewer people are reading the main stories until a few months before the election, it flips. And so what this chart actually measures is Facebook engagements. And for those who don't know that term, it's a measurement of like shares, sharing Facebook posts or reacting to Facebook posts or commenting on Facebook posts. It basically means more eyeballs are on totally made up stories than totally real stories. And we're going to take a deep dive into one. It's one of my favorite parts of this slide. How many of you guys saw this headline or heard about this before the election? How many of you guys think the Pope endorses any candidate, let alone an American candidate? He doesn't, as we'll see. So this headline, Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president. Right, here's how this story came to be and how massive it became. It was originally posted on a site called WTOE5 News, which, if you don't know what that is, maybe it's a television station somewhere in America. It sounds like, that could be that. It was picked up by a blog called Ending the Fed. Now, that first site is since shut down. But when it was up, it had this disclaimer on its homepage, which you can read for yourself right here. Most articles are satire or pure fantasy, right? So that should have ended this whole thing right then and there. Unfortunately, it didn't. And a week before the election, the Pope himself commented on this publicly, saying, "I never say a word about electoral campaigns." That didn't stop this train. from coming. And so by election day, the story that had been picked up by that Ending the Fed post blog site had nearly 1 million reactions. 1 million, that's a ton, right? And a month after the election, the Pope is still talking about fake news. An interview with the Belgian Catholic Weekly calling it a quote sin and a quote sickness. Now, that story in and of itself is interesting, that timeline. What I've done here, as you can see, is what any good journalist will do. These are hyperlinks. And so if this was in front of you on your computer, you could click through the words Reuters, BuzzFeed, Tertio, and CNBC to the source documents of these stories. You could see on the Reuters page that I quoted the Pope exactly. You could see on the BuzzFeed page that that is the exact statistic. You could see on the Tertio page the entire Q&A with the Pope, and then you could see the CNBC story that wraps this all together. That's what journalists do. We don't just make stories up. We tell you exactly where the information is coming from. So fast forward to 2018. This was in January. And for those of you who follow the Pope on Twitter will know that he's very active and very entertaining. And this was a tweet storm he had about fake news just in this year, 2018. He's still talking about it. Talking about journalism of peace. The most radical antidote to the virus of falsehood is purification by the truth. Trusting in falsehood can have dire consequences, right? All true, all being seen by thousands or tens of thousands of people. And so this is still a problem today. Now this is another part of the interactive a part of this slideshow. I'm going to show you some headlines, and I'm going to ask you whether you think this is real, fake, or you don't know, right? CDC doctor, disastrous, in quotes, flu shot is causing deadly flu outbreak. How many of you guys think that's true? Couple? 3?
You mean whether it was a headline or whether it's true?
No, these are good question. These are actual headlines that I've lifted off the internet, but whether the story is accurate and true or not. So a few think it's real. How many of you guys think it's fake? A few more. How many of you guys don't know? The honest ones. Nice job, Tim. This is fake, right? Flu shots don't cause flu outbreaks. So anyone grounded in science would know that, but it's a CDC doctor, maybe that sounds legit. So again, this is the hyperlink. You can click through and see the actual story, but it sounds like it could be true, right?
Well, there were a lot of stories afterwards countering that.
Correct.
So,
And this is actually an interesting part of journalism, right? I think in the 2016 election, when those presidential debates were unfolding, you saw outlets in real time devoting more resources and more staffing power to fact-checking those candidates, again, in real time, than you'd ever seen before. Unprecedented. That never happened. And did it really matter? I mean, she lied. He lied a lot. One of them was going to win. You know, I think that that's kind of a broken system. Personally, I think that fact-checking that much doesn't really make a lot of sense because it's just lost. It's white noise. It's lost by the end of the night and by the next day, certainly. Maybe a better approach is climate change. Here are all the mistruths or, you know, exaggerations.
Would it have made a difference had CDC been spelled out in terms of people's?
Maybe. Good question.
Yeah.
Good question. Some people don't know what the CDC is, Centers for Disease Control. You know? Yeah, that's an interesting question.
So Matt, remember Jeffrey Lord
Mm-hmm.
was on CNN
Mhm.
during the presidential of 16? And I heard him say, he really said this, not fake, he said, you know, these days, I think facts are overrated.
well,
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the Trump.
Yeah, he's a Trump guy.
He
Needless to say, needless to say.
He's off.
Yeah, he's off. But facts are overrated.
I mean, they are for some people. Look, he won.
They are.
well,
You know what I mean?
several people in that campaign said that, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but you have to believe that when Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great senator from New York, said that everyone is,
Title, yeah.
no one is entitled to their own facts, but everyone's entitled to their own opinion, which is something that Alan Simpson often cited. But a lot of people don't get that either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's a thing about the alternate facts, right, when we talked about
Right.
it,
Mhm.
the,
Alternative facts, yeah.
wasn't that somebody, was that Kellyanne?
Kellyanne Conway, yeah, it was.
She
Yeah,
had a real run there.
yeah. Well, she's still with the administration.
One of the few.
And when you're talking about citing the facts, facts or recording them, it seems like the real power doesn't even lie in facts. It's be the first to get the message out. Because now you put the other side on defensive and having to justify.
That's a good point.
They're now trying to establish their truth and their standards of truth when it's the first party in the first instance that was.
So are you asking about Dolly?
Yeah, okay, so here's the next headline. Singer Dolly Parton, Trump in 1 year is already better than 16 years of Bush and Obama put together. How many of you guys like Dolly Parton, first of all? Pretty awesome singer, right? Yeah, pretty awesome. How many of you guys think this is a real headline, that she actually said this? Don't know? How many of you guys think it's fake? Don't know. Don't know, right? This is also fake. But this is the classic example of celebrity X says thing Y that you either totally agree with or totally disagree with. So if you click through again, you would see that this is not an actual story. But you see this happen more and more because it's very easy and people listen to celebrities more. It's the culture we live in.
Well, can I make a point? Particularly on Facebook, I have a friend in Colorado, and from time to time she'll post something, and she had read it or someone had sent it to her. She does no fact checking.
Right.
And I have to point out to her somewhat painfully, because I like her, that's untrue.
Right.
That never happened. But you begin to wonder if that is true in your own little circle of friends.
Well, think of how widespread it is,
people on Facebook, then magnify it how many millions of times, and you've got a serious problem.
Yeah, no. You know, I look back, we talk a lot about the current president, about the last president, and the stories that circulated that said he was a Muslim. You know, I mean, so then the question becomes, with your Facebook friends, do you push back? Do you say that it's a false story? Do you not go there? You know, this last election, my family had big arguments on Facebook to the point where people were unfriending each other. That's how heated the politics became, right? I mean, this is our family. Like, can we just get along at Thanksgiving? I mean, that's what the kids' table is for, right?
By Outback, do you mean the restaurant?
Yeah, so here's the next one. Outback is the restaurant.
Oh, the restaurant.
Outback employees return from mandatory, which is an Australian steakhouse, right? 6-month walkabout in Australia. How many of you guys think this is real? You can help with the laughter. I'm just going to jump ahead. This is from The Onion. Satire, right? But also, well, maybe that sounds real. That sounds funny. You know, satire. Last one. Pipe bomb handed back to passenger by airport guard. How many of you guys think this is fake? It's got to be. It can't be real, right? How many of you guys think it's real? George, how many of you guys don't know? Don't know. Okay. George, you win this one. For the record, this is not the TSA. This is from Canada. But this was an actual news story. It sounds so preposterous, right? So this is where we're at now. Like, now we're second-guessing ourselves. Now we don't know what's real and what's fake. That's a problem too, right? This is a real story. Kind of a terrifying one, if you ask me. But, right? And so now we'll take a deep dive into, this is a fairly recent study, a massive survey of 20,000 U.S. adults. Gallup and Knaught Foundation are pretty reputable organizations. And what they found in this study is super interesting. 84% of the people who responded say the media has a critical or very important role to play in democracy. That's good, right? That's good, because it's true. Yet only 44%, less than half, can name an objective news source. That's horrible. That's terrible.
Very slippery term.
And we'll get into that. Yeah, it's a good point. But it's an important distinction to know. So here's another. 58% say all these many news sources that we have to choose from these days make it harder to be informed. 38% say it's actually easier. Now, I think this is a case where they're both right, but it makes a very interesting point. It used to be Walter Cronkite, one person, would tell you the news of the day in a way that you could digest very easily, very conveniently. It's appointment television, and you trusted him. Now, there are scores, hundreds of news sources. And as we'll see here, they span a spectrum of reliability and objectivity. But it's up to the reader, the viewer, the listener to figure out who to trust.
Well, more people are informed and more
More people are misinformed. What was the first one?
More people are informed.
Informed.
And more people are misinformed.
True. True. So 2 out of 3 people say the news media does not do a good job of separating fact from opinion, up from 42%. So that is a trend that's going in the wrong direction. It shows that not only is journalism, I think people have the appearance that it is not doing a good job, it actually is not doing a good job. Like I'll be the first person to tell you that a lot of journalism's wounds are self-inflicted. Like you talked about Judith Miller earlier. Journalists need to know if they make a mistake, they need to correct it if it's a mistake. So they need to take a second, digest it. I don't mean a literal second, but make sure that they got it right. And if the facts are wrong, they need to correct it in a fast and a way and in a place that everyone will see it.
Something that Max might inform that last bullet is what news media represents to different people.
Also a good point.
News media, I think of the standards you're talking about,
Yeah.
journalistic standards. But I think people are conflating these days, every outlet, every voice
Yeah.
is news media.
Yeah.
So there's no.
Did you put the slideshow together? Because that's like the next, that's like the next slide. Yeah, no, that's also, how people's definition of media is different. And you see that, when you watch TV, you have Sean Hannity on one side, Rachel Maddow on the other. There's a spectrum on your television. When you pick up a magazine, you pick up, The Economist or the Weekly Standard or the National Review, or, that all seeps into news coverage. Here's another one. Half of people are confident they can cut through that, what you just talked about, to sort out the facts, and that's down from 66% a generation ago. So again, people are less comfortable being able to do that.
Because there's more of it.
Because there's more, because it can be nefarious and Machiavellian in the way you present it, and there's, again, the tips I'll show you on how to cut through that. But it really is no longer just sitting in front of your television and having the news wash over you. You need to proactively know what to read, how to read it, who to read, et cetera, et cetera. And so here again, you see a trend from 1989 when 1 out of 4 people saw political bias in news coverage to 45%. Is that number going up because it's increasing, because people think it's increasing? A bit of both, but it definitely is increasing. And here's the point I wanted to, this is what I was talking about. So what is media, right? This is a graphic I picked up on Reddit. I don't show it here to say that it's definitely the way that you should view these news sources. I share it to show you that this is how people are plotting news outlets on scales of neutrality and quality, just what we talked about, right?
So to add Sinclair now.
True. Although Fox 5, which was just going to be, is now going to be sold off, so at least that station won't be brought into the fold of Sinclair. So here we have on the far right InfoWars, which is Alex Jones's kind of shop. I don't even know what you want to call it. Pick garbage works. Kind of. I think we can all agree that's where it deserves to be, right? And looking at the top of the chart for kind of high quality neutral reporting, you have wire services of AP and Reuters. Again, probably where they deserve to be. C-SPAN, which is just straight up video of politicians speaking. The Economist, which for those who don't know is a very interesting magazine out of Europe, where they actually don't have bylines. They kind of trust their reporters to each write in their own, in a collective kind of institutional voice. Very interesting worldview. And then as you move to the left and the right, you kind of see the big newspapers, right? The Post and the Times on the left, Wall Street Journal on the right. You see Fox News and CNN, and then you see websites like the Daily Caller and Breitbart, and then kind of Vox and Think Progress. So as a consumer of news, you should be asking yourself, well, who put this slideshow together, right? How do I trust their biases? And so here's another way to consume this same information. This is a study by the University of Missouri, a very reputable school. 9,000 people almost, so again, a pretty big sample size. And this measures least and most trusted news sources. And what you see is most trusted are similar to that last slide. We have public radio and television, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, some regional papers, because they did a more expansive look. And then as you get to the top, you see what you see. And you see Trump on there and Occupy Democrats.
Why did Yahoo wind up on the least trusted?
Have you seen Yahoo recently?
Huh?
Have you seen Yahoo recently? I mean, Yahoo News is kind of like an aggregator, and they do a lot of, it's like Kardashian. It's more ice cream journalism than broccoli journalism, as I like to say. You know, and again, we can quibble with what's where.
It's partly opinion too, because I consider public television trusted, but
Right.
I know it's been criticized
Yeah.
highly as being. not
There are some people who think the
trusted.
government shouldn't be funding it, right?
Right.
And so again, this plays into what we were just talking about. This, you might say, this, you know, the people answering the survey might have been leaning to the left, right?
Say so.
Rather than the right. And so this is all, as you're consuming news, you yourself need to make these decisions and be leery of that. And I think that's a very good point to make, so thank you for making it. All right, so here are the tips, and we can kind of zip through these. These are super helpful.
Final point perhaps to consider is significantly you've left off where a lot of young people get their news now, and that is from individual voices.
Mm-hmm.
And they've become hugely significant in my kind of empirical observations. People are loyal to them, they go to them for the majority of their news and rely upon them.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think, and that's another discussion. I have a whole set of talking points on that, on how to use social media and consume social media and choose who to follow on social media. But clearly, like every time I speak to a group, especially of students, I ask them, how do you get your news, right? Newspaper. If 2 hands go up, I'm grateful. TV and radio, a few more. You know, Facebook, podcasting, email newsletters, like, you know, and then you get down to Snapchat and more hands go up. Like, just shout it out. How do you get your news? Radio.
Like apps.
Apps. Any particular apps or?
I get like a CNN app.
Okay, awesome.
Podcasts and emails.
Podcasts and emails. Okay. Which podcasts?
The Daily.
The Daily.
How about the professor?
I
Dean.
go to the New York Times every day, that's for sure.
The website?
The website, and I get the Sunday hard copy thrown under my car.
You got to talk to your delivery person.
Every Sunday I push it by the muffler.
Exercise. That's, you know, that's our talking point. Yeah, so to your point, that's a lot how people don't read the New York Times. Most people don't go to the site anymore. Once you start getting younger and younger, they choose to follow Maggie Haberman on Twitter. You know, and so they trust her. Some people like her opinions, which she throws in, the snark that she throws in on a regular basis. Some people don't like that. As a journalist, we have a policy at the Union-Tribune where you're not supposed to share your opinions unless you work on my team. So a lot of people want to work on my team. You know what I mean? But like before the election came out, Jeff Light, the editor and the publisher, sent out an email saying, we've gotten very close to the election. We've done pretty good as an outlet. Do not do anything stupid the last 3 days that's going to tear down the credibility of our outlet and yourself by sharing your opinion on Twitter. Leave that to Matt's team. You know, and that's what journalists should be doing. So I think it's a slippery slope. We've kind of opened this door and people are sharing their opinions on Twitter. And I think the pendulum's going to start swinging back the other way. You've already seen some journalists get into trouble for sharing their views, lose their jobs, be censured or disciplined, suspended. And that is something we all need to be mindful of, you know, because I do think it weakens your credibility. You know what I mean? If you're covering SDSU West and Soccer City, and you're like all in on SDSU West on Twitter, unless you're a columnist, that's a problem, right? That's a problem. So look, here's some great tips to help you guys kind of cut through some of this. We had the exercise with the headline, so read beyond the headline. Don't just share it if you haven't clicked through. As you're a journalist writing a headline, be mindful that that headline needs to sell the story and not oversell it or overhype it. The industry is shifting. It used to be all in on page views, and you tried to kind of game the system through SEO and social media by getting people to click through your story. If you have a headline that oversells it, people are going to click through, be dissatisfied. They're less likely to click through a second time, right? So from a journalistic standpoint, that's why you want to have a headline that is entertaining and it pushes the envelope a little, but doesn't over-exaggerate the story. And as a reader, you want to make sure that the story you're sharing is accurate and actual. You don't want to share Pope endorsed Trump if that didn't happen.
Do you think when the New York Post ran that famous headline, headless man found in topless bar, that there needed to be more to
I was there.
That's a classic headline.
What are you reading, George?
No, it's true.
Yeah, Google it. That's one of the most famous headlines ever.
Is it true that the person that writes the headline, is it still true that the person who writes the headline is not the person that writes the story?
No.
No?
Usually the journalist writes the story. These days,
Writes the headline? The
Correct.
journalist writes the headline?
let me draw a distinction. Online, for the online post,
In a print newspaper?
but in a print newspaper, there are editors who do
Who
that.
did headline?
Correct. Yeah. And you're seeing fewer of this, but there used to be, I could say for the newspaper, here's the process. Reporter writes, editor edits, depending on the team, either the editor or the reporter will have written the headline. It'll go online. For the newspaper, then there are copy editors involved, depending on the type of story. More editors, the more important it is. On some stories, a lawyer will get involved if it's a deep investigation or potentially problematic. So there are definitely more checks in the newspaper, but there are starting to be fewer and fewer because money's tight, and journalism costs money.
It's a quick thing about news also has a way of being entertainment. And the New York Post is a very entertaining newspaper. It may not be filled with the most accurate or compelling news, but it's very fun to read. And that's the whole thing about news and truth and journalism. It's a bigger world out there than just the hardcore of journalism, which we all, I assume, worship. But these days, there's a lot, even more than we ever could have imagined 20 years ago, 50 years ago. So many different sources out there, and it's entertainment. And is that fake news? Well, sort of. It's on the fringes.
Real is
New York
real.
Post is fun to read. It is politically right-wing, but it comes up with some great stories and great headlines. It's
Well-
entertaining. It's not the New York Times. You read the Post, the Daily News, New York Times, it's a different city. It's a different world.
Yeah, true. Here's another trick that people are starting to become wiser to. Check the date of the story that you're reading. A lot of these stories about emotional issues with long tails, immigration being one, people will recycle and resurface old stories, and they've either become dated or the person as the subject of the story has changed their view. So check the date.
That's a real problem on the internet. If you Google something, all of a sudden, oh, I was just reading it, that's 15 or 12, and I can't believe that they don't
Yeah.
put
Well,
a correct date
the
on
the
there.
pace of news is so fast now.
Yeah.
A lot of times you can post a story and it'll be out of date either immediately or very soon thereafter. So a reputable outlet will probably not just delete the story, but they'll have at the very top update, Pompeo has been confirmed, and then link to that story. Consider the source, right? The Union-Tribune on its website will have a mission statement, contact information for editors, reporters, for everyone. Look at the URL of your headline. This is another sneaky way. They'll have a site that kind of looks like CBS, but if you look closely, the URL says cbs.com.co because it's produced in Colombia, and it can be completely fake. This is how a lot of people, a couple months ago, a lot of my friends on Facebook thought that San Diego was getting Google's new headquarters. And obviously we're not, but they were sharing a fake story that was exactly .com.co. So check the URL. Check the author. You can do a very quick web search of an author to make sure that person is legit, has written other reputable stories. You don't come up with a story that says that they lied or made stuff up. On posts, a lot of the UT stories will have a link to an email for our bylines. So you can reach out to us and you can ask us a question. That engagement, super important, increasingly popular. If you can't figure out how to reach the reporter, then that website isn't really doing it right. Not that it's necessarily making it up, but they're not being as transparent and engaging as they could. Ask yourself if it's meant to be a joke. That Onion headline about the Outback was pretty funny, you know. It's meant to be satirical. Supporting sources, I showed you that one slide, right, that had the links to Reuters and CNBC and Tertio, like hyperlinked background sources, documents, source documents, maybe in PDF form. Put all that on there if you're a journalist. Does the website allow for corrections? This is super important. Journalists we talked about earlier, journalists make mistakes. Maybe they're not as high profile as Judith Miller's, but we make mistakes all the time. I'll tell you a great example from the Union-Tribune. This is how seriously I take mistakes. We had a pro-con package on Ashford University about 3 or 4 months ago. You guys know what Ashford University obviously is, right? And so this is Xavier Becerra, the Attorney General, is suing the university, saying that they had done some shady stuff. And so we reached out to top management at the university to have us do a piece that defended the university. And we had someone who used to work at the place and talking about how it's a sweatshop and they're not taking students very seriously. We published them. It was a very good package, I thought. I got a call the next day from someone who said that the person we had criticizing the university had gotten fired from the university as an employee and as a student hadn't graduated. Now, does that cause you to re-examine his arguments? Of course. Should we have presented that to the public immediately? Yes. Did I know that was true? No. So I spent several days trying to find records that would prove that. We got the records, we could prove it. We realized that we should have shared that information at the beginning of the process, and because we didn't, it colored or would color everyone's view. So I took the post down, so you can't find it on the internet, and I replaced it with a note that said we strive to be, to provide context in everything we do. We fell short in this case, we apologize, and in the paper I ran a correction that said, a similar note. Now that's a lot of egg on my face. That's a pretty major step to actually pull something down. Good journalists will do that, right? My reputation, is my reputation. And so I think people will look at that anecdote and say, you failed, I'm over you, I don't like you, I don't respect you. Some will say, this is how seriously you take the business, good for you. And some people will be in the middle. But the point is, you gotta have a way to correct your stories. Has someone else picked up the story? If they have, and it's a legitimate news outlet, more likely to be trustworthy. And it only takes a quick search to see if that's the case. This is important. Check your own biases. We talked about journalist biases. Readers have their own biases too, right? If you were on the left or the right side of the aisle, you're maybe disinclined to believe people on the other side, which is a whole other problem with the country right now, frankly. But make sure that you don't believe something because you want to believe it. Consult experts. Phone a friend, right? Talk to a literal friend, maybe on Facebook. Ask someone in your family. Ask a librarian. That's one thing that they do very well. And this is important too. This is something that journalism has done very poorly, I think, for a long, long time. Maybe they never did a good job of it. Know the difference between a news story and an opinion piece, right? I think journalists kind of expected people to just understand what a news story was and an editorial and an op-ed. And I don't even know if people know what op-ed stands for. It literally stands for opposite the editorial page. So in a newspaper, you have your editorial page, which usually in our paper will have Steve Breen's cartoon, 1 or 2 editorials that we've written, letters to the editor, and a syndicated column. And opposite that page, on the op-ed page, will be community essays that are straight opinion pieces, that are the community's opinions, not our opinions, but the community's. And that, we talked about it earlier, trying to have a varied and multifaceted conversation. That's what our page tries to do, is to share views that we don't necessarily agree with, that will kind of move us all towards a better San Diego.
I had a friend, Stephen Weisman, was on the editorial page of the New York Times, and I went to visit him once at the Times, and all of the editorial page writers, they were on a separate floor.
Yeah.
And there was a very high wall. They were paid directly by the publisher, They were, other times people were paid by the normal, whatever that system was. But people, when they judged the Times, they judged the whole newspaper by
Right.
the editorial page,
Yeah.
which is unfair. And that happened with the Union-Tribune. And I've always tried to point out to people, no, the editorial page that's the policy of the publisher. And, you know, it's not the news page. But I think not a very good job. I mean, I think this is important, what you've done, because not a very good job is to fix in people's mind that there's
Yeah.
a difference.
That's a very good point. And you see, especially online now, a lot of the bigger outlets, and I'm trying to figure out a way for us to do this too. Like the New York Times will say, by the New York Times editorial board, what the editorial board is. That the editorial board is a collection of writers, and it is the editorial board and the editor and the publisher, and our opinions speak for only us, right? The Washington Post does something very similar, where if you hover over a line on their site, a pop-up will show up, and it will explain what an editorial is. You know, I mean, I was a reporter for years, and a lot of times when I was trying to, as I said, count the lines for each story and each side, you know, we would have an editorial that day ripping one side or the other. And they would take it out, hold on, I was like, I tried to explain that to them, and some get it, some don't, but it's a tricky thing, and like I said, we've done a very bad job of explaining it to people.
But a lot of news stories are really, well, on the news pages,
Mm-hmm.
are very slanted nowadays.
Some, it depends on your point of view, but yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems that journalists have, is that they're providing context, but once you get away from the sky is blue to it was a gloomy day, well, maybe you're having a great day. Maybe you like the rain. Is that gloomy to you? No. Maybe you're a kid who likes to stomp in puddles. That's the opposite of a gloomy day. So, but I do agree with that.
Something maybe I should ask before, what do you do, or I noticed you haven't mentioned anonymous sources.
Yeah. I hate them.
I mean, yeah, I'm sure, but it's gotta be almost impossible to write certain stories without.
Well, look at the Russian investigation. That is done mostly with anonymous sources. Now, if you don't like the president, those stories are great to you. You're going to share them all day. If you like the president, you're outraged because someone who's not putting their name, where you can judge, like the point I just talked about with the student at the university. It's like you need to know people's biases, where they're coming from, so you can. Well, do they have an agenda? I don't know. Are they a disgruntled former employee? That's different than a disgruntled employee, for sure. And so anonymous sources are tricky. There are some stories that you need anonymous sources for. When I was a journalist, I tried to use them very sparingly. So that's, again, that people are measuring our credibility, our neutrality, our quality. The use of how an outlet uses anonymous sources, whether they use them, when they use them, how frequently they use them, what context they provide for the use of them. You know, like the Me Too stories, like most outlets don't identify victims of sexual abuse for good reason. Does that mean we should never report that? Well, then those stories don't get in the paper. I mean, think about America or the world before Harvey Weinstein, like late September. This was a different world. In the last 6 months, we just saw Bill Cosby for something that happened 14 years ago. And as I was leaving the office, someone said, I shouldn't say this, Brokaw or Rather?
Yeah.
Do you guys know this?
Oh, I saw it.
So,
I saw it.
a top anchor.
Matt Lauer both came up together.
Matt Lauer.
So and so some of those stories, so anonymous sources is a very complicated issue. You know what I mean? I think there are some worth to them, but they should be used sparingly.
If you take the example of President Trump's nominee to head the veterans, I mean, he's withdrawn it.
Yeah.
I think I posted on Facebook that even though it was a Democratic senator who did it, I thought it was a McCarthyism attack upon him. And I remember specifically that when he was nominated, President Obama's press secretary, who you see frequently on MSNBC, was asked about him. And what he said is, he is one of the finest human beings I've ever met. That's what Obama's press secretary said. And so this guy, his life is effectively destroyed.
Well, he was a White House doctor under previous presidents, not just for Obama,
Yeah.
you know?
George, both probably are true. Both
Yes,
probably are true.
Yeah.
it's probably
Because
both, I
people can
thought
be
both were
very
true.
I
complicated.
thought he got railroaded, and I've tried to figure out why, because, I mean.
Well, that's a complicated issue
I
too.
don't think he should run the VA because he had no experience,
Right.
but that was a whole different.
Yeah, well, we just had an editorial, I think it was yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, that said, you know, we should let them confirm Pompeo, but not the VA pick, you know, because of what was brought up. Like, and the VA, I mean, San Diego, we're a military town. The VA needs a kick in the pants, frankly. They need, not what it does, but management of that organization has been poor for a long, long time. And that is one of the most important organizations in the country. So kind of getting a little off topic, but I'm emotional about those things. Yeah, we're almost done here. So this is a quick slideshow that shows, we've talked about whether it's real or fake. So what's the next question? Should I share it, right? Do I share it? How do I share it? We talked about journalists pushing back on fake news. Do we have a fake check? Do we say this fake story is not true and here's why? So ask yourself these questions as you're thinking of doing it, you know. Is it share-worthy? Is it real? Is it well crafted? Is it news or opinion? And is it sneaky about its opinion, if so? Is it backed up by facts? Is there a clear bias? And we talked about bias and how people see that obviously differently, correct? And then lastly, does it entertain and or raise awareness, you know? The Onion is very good because it's fake, but it's funny in pointed ways, right? And so this is my last slide. I mean, I think we talked about kind of handling criticism and credibility. Journalism is as important as it's ever been, if not more important right now. We have a lot of targets on our back, sometimes literally in countries where journalists are being killed. Mexico to the south is a good example of that. In America, it hasn't quite gotten that bad, but with the president and other politicians using fake news as a shield and as a weapon, increasingly troubling. So handling credibility is a big part of the job, handling criticism. Being out in the community, journalists should be talking to you. If you try to reach out to a journalist and they don't return your call or your email, I think you can hold that against them. In this day and age, we should all be communicating with our audiences, with the people that we live next door to, because we want to hear from you, right? That's the last sentence here, because it's true, is, you know, I love talking to groups like this, being held accountable, being criticized, you know, because it helps make a stronger kind of work product, and that makes a stronger community. So thanks for coming out.
Oh, thank you.
Actually, or the reporters,
Say it again?
you can call the reporters at the union just by calling the union and.
Well, if you call the main number, you can. I would not recommend that. I would say our email is the best way, and on our site, a lot of times they do have phone numbers for each of the,
Well, I just
yeah.
phone and they will ask for.
Yeah, a lot of times, and this just came up at a talk I gave, someone had called because a reporter got something wrong. How many calls and emails do you think that reporter got that day? 100 plus. So that reporter's not gonna call everyone back, so that's why it's a difficult job, right? Like, should you, I stay late and email everyone who emails me, most days. Sometimes I like to go home and see my kids before they're sleeping. You know, but it's important to do that, you know what I mean? It's important to do that.
You're doing, I think that what you're doing is something that I've long felt should be done, which is that there should be a journalist in somebody's classroom every week. Because for the very reason that young people growing up don't have that experience. I'm sorry there weren't more people here, but you were
okay.
terrific. We will expand the audience significantly on YouTube.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. I appreciate it.